Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stitching Tales. I am Johanna Lundström, the author of several sewing books, including Sewing Jeans and Fit for Knits, and I also have my own sewing pattern line under the brand name The Last Stitch.
And my name is Malena Hjerpe, and I work as a freelance pattern maker, and I also create my own PDF patterns under the name Hazelhen Patterns.
And today's episode we're going to talk about something that we both are a little bit not perhaps our best thing to sew, right? And when we did an episode a while back here when we talked about sewing pants and sewing waistbands, we kind of skimmed over this particular topic. And you might wonder what was that topic? Well, it was buttons, and in particular buttonholes, because that's perhaps not our most favorite thing to sew, Malena. So what's your feelings around buttonholes and buttons on garments?
Yeah, you're 100% right. Not really my favorite thing. Usually you save it until last thing, same as with the hems. And then it's just that one thing that can ruin the whole project. So it's a little bit of a like, I don't wanna do it. So I can understand if anyone else feels intimidated by it. We totally get you.
Yeah, we totally get you. And I thought it was a good thing to do this episode because I think we all come from the same perspective. Yeah, buttonholes, it adds some anxiety. It's not the most thrilling thing to do unless you want to be like slightly scared. I guess that's if you enjoy that kind of roller coaster ride when it comes to sewing buttonholes is definitely for you. But we do sew buttonholes from time to time, and so we should at least try to address it and give our thoughts around it and share some tips on how to be successful with it. And just with everything else, with practice you will become better, maybe not perfect, but at least you will just be more, it will be more and more easier. But first of all, before you even start sewing the buttonholes, one thing that you really need to nail is the placement of the buttonholes and how that is spread out. And Malena, in your day job you work as a freelance pattern maker, so I'm really curious to know how is like the buttonholes positioned and drafted when you're doing professional sewing patterns for the garment industry?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on which brand I've been working on. Like they do it a little bit different, but usually you just make a mark where the button should be and the buttonhole should be. And then the supplier actually does the actual buttonhole size themselves and the actual placement. Because as you said, it's a little bit tricky, this one actually. The actual button, then it's quite easy. I mean, for example, on a shirt, you sew it on the center front line, of course. But then the buttonhole should actually be, it depends a little bit, of course, if you have a vertical buttonhole, then that one should also be placed on the center front line. But if you have horizontal buttonholes, then you don't want to place that in the middle of the center front line, because then the buttonhole is gonna be pulled to the edge, and then it actually will move a couple of millimeters, half centimeter maybe, depending on how big the buttonhole is. So if you have horizontal buttonholes, you actually want the edge of the buttonhole to be placed at the center front line, not the actual buttonhole stitches. It's the actual hole that should be placed on the center front line, because then when you button it and it's closed, then it will be, both center front lines are going to be meeting each other when you wear it. So it's a little bit, you need to think a little bit with how you place the actual buttonholes. And you can have it on shirts, men's shirts, and when you have shirts with plackets, then you usually have it vertically, just because it's visually more nice when the placket is, I mean, there are straight lines, so then the buttonholes actually follows the line. And also usually on shirts they are a little bit more bigger, they have more plus ease of movement, so it's not so much stress on the buttons and buttonholes, so you can have it vertically. But if you have a little more tight fitted shirt or blouse or something, then I would recommend it actually to do it horizontally, because then it's not as easy that when you pull the fabric apart, like the buttons is not gonna be popping up, popping out. That is more easily happening if they are vertically. So that's a good thing to remember, that if it's a little bit tighter and the blouse, for example, then horizontal is better placement for it.
Yeah, it's very true, because if it starts pulling up and the buttonhole starts pulling up, when you have these small buttons, there's quite a big risk actually that it kind of slips through the buttonholes and pops up. So that's a really good like rule of thumb. I agree with you absolutely, and also I think
as you see on trousers, then it's always horizontally, because it's always pulled. To the edge of the buttonhole. It doesn't pop out if it's horizontally, but if it would be vertically, it would be popping up open.
Yeah, it's true. I don't think I've ever seen a pair of pants that has a vertical buttonholes, and so if you get tempted to like some rules are there for a reason, I guess. And that's probably one of those. So even though it might seem like a fun design feature, probably not a great idea to do that. So that's a really good point. And another thing I'm curious about is positioning, because you have buttonholes, but where should you place them? Are there any particular place on your body? For instance, if you're adding buttonholes to a shirt, should one button be where your fullest bust is, if you have that, or your tummy? What's the like general rules around where to place those key buttons?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the style and a little bit on your bodies as well. I think on men's shirts, for example, or oversized shirts, it's not that important that the button. You usually want to have a button at your like fullest bust point, because that will help the shirt from. It will prevent from the gape, like the center front from gaping open. So that's why you want to have a button placed there. But if it's a more relaxed fit or a men's shirt, then it's not so crucial that the button is actually at the highest bust point, because it's so you have such so much ease of movement, so it doesn't really matter. But for a little bit more tighter fitted shirt, then you definitely want to have one at across the center bust point height. And then it becomes a little bit, you need to calculate a little bit then. Like, do you want, because then the distance between the buttons will not be exactly the same, because you have like the highest bust point then, and then you have the collar like slightly below there. Like, where do you want to place a button in the middle of that? And then maybe you don't want the exact same distance. It might look weird with the last button. So if it's important to you that you want to have that highest point button there, then the other buttons might actually not have the actual same distance. This is something that only you will notice when you wear it. Trust me, nobody else is gonna like see that, the spacing is not even, what's happened there? Like, no, it's just you. And maybe other sewists will notice this kind of thing. But they will pay attention to, she has a button at the highest bust point. Nicely done. So, just saying. Nobody's gonna pay that much attention to it.
That's very, very reassuring to hear, because it's also easy for us so is that we kind of get overly obsessive and almost to the point of being anal about these kind of details, and we think it's like a screaming situation, whereas, as you say, no one else would notice it. And of course the math won't be mathing. Obviously, sometimes, because there might be, because especially if you're on the shorter side, if you place a button at the bust area, and then you will have, tricky to find, should it be one button between the bust and the neckline, or should it be two buttons? So it's a little bit tricky, and as you say, you might not be able to also place on your fully part of your tummy, for instance, because you can't get that right. So you have to like do a little bit pros and cons. And also, I guess a good rule of thumb is, of course, also if you have a more tight-fitting garment, you should also have more buttons, right, to keep it together. Would you say that, Malena?
Yeah, I mean, In the fast fashion industry, we try to save every penny we can, so removing a button or two might be a good cost-conscious way of saving a little bit. But when you sew it yourself, I mean, you can have as many buttons as you want. Like, you can have it more, the space tighter compared to a ready-to-wear garment, definitely. And it will make it obviously more secure because less gaping and everything. So definitely you can choose how many buttons you want and prefer. And with tighter fitted garment, definitely a little bit more because it's less risk for gaping then.
Yeah.
And I actually saw this was a really interesting post I saw on Instagram. It was from, I think she's called A Look Behind the Seam. We will add this on our Instagram as well, so you can see it for yourself. But she was talking about a difference between luxury brands and fast fashion with the placement of the button and buttonholes. And I found that's really interesting. And I haven't heard about this before, so it's really, like, I try to, see it several times and really understand why and read the comments because someone was explaining it really, like, exactly why would you do this. And it was that the buttonhole and the button placement, they are actually not exactly the same on all the buttons for a shirt, for example. They actually placed, I think, the button on, now we are talking about vertical buttonholes, so they placed the button actually on the first button a little bit higher up, like at the upper end of the buttonhole, and then gradually a little bit lower, and like, for example, the button at the highest bust point, that was centered, and then as it moved on further down, like, the placement of the button was a little bit more on the lower side on the buttonhole. And then this made it actually, the buttonhole, like the front pieces are not shifting then, and it prevents it from gaping a little bit because they are more in place. Because if you have all vertical buttonholes and then you place the button in the middle on every single buttonhole, the front parts can actually move up and down like 1 centimeter, depending a little bit on how big buttonhole you have. But this way, since the upper button is fixating the upper hole and the lowest is fixating the lower buttonhole, they are like preventing it from shifting. Again, this is how I understood it. Please, if anyone has a better explanation of it, write us a comment. I found it really, this kind of thing is really interesting to know. And it's actually, it is not an actual cost to place the buttons differently. It takes a little bit of time, of course, but as a home sewist, you can definitely do this.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any difference price-wise or time-wise, to be honest, when sewing. The placement, when you mark on the fabric, sure, a little bit more thinking goes into it. But definitely take advantage of these kind of small things to improve your sewing.
Yeah, that's such an interesting concept. I never even thought about that, and I guess that's kind of those tiny little details, especially as when you have these vertical buttonholes, there's always a risk that they might pop up as well, and now you get that nice stability without the shifting of the fabric. And I'm definitely going to try this. So I figure I guess the easiest thing would be to just adjust the actual button so that the buttons are not 100% evenly spaced then between, so you're going to slightly shift the buttons downwards for each, so at the final one it ends at the lower part of the lowest buttonholes. It sounds really, really interesting. And again, you can just, I guess, test and fit, and then if it doesn't work out, you can just shift up the buttons again because you haven't really committed to anything because you're just attaching the buttons. So I guess it will be easier to try this and adjust the buttons rather than the buttonholes. And especially
when you cut open a buttonhole, you're kind of, that's set in stone then. But the buttons you can play around with. Yeah,
you're kind of screwed if you end up. So we're definitely going to talk more about sewing buttonholes in just a bit here, because that's probably the thing that we are the most anxious around. And also you bring up such a great point, of also that the fact that you have to place the button, if you're doing horizontal, that you have to place the buttonhole slightly shifted so that the outer outer opening edge basically aligns with the center front where you place the buttons. And I also saw an interesting, because obviously, your sewing pattern will come with suggestions, of course, where to place the buttons, but also it's good to know, for instance, that if you do any length adjustments, that you either shorten your pattern if you're sewing a shirt, or it can be anything with a button closure dress or a skirt, you will shift that. So you have to, even though the pattern has suggestions, you still have to do that, because if you, for instance, shorten the length between the bust and the tummy area, for instance, then of course you will end up with uneven spacing. So you have to respace the buttonhole. So it's always good to put on the garment, place pins where you think that you should place the buttonholes, and just move around and see if there's any gaping. Do you need to add more pins? And then you have a rough idea on how many buttons you need and where they should be placed for like optimal security. And you mentioned before we started recording this also, Malena, about an interesting factoid that there's an idea about an odd or an uneven numbers of buttons is preferable. So what's that about?
Yeah, so this is a design rule, I'm using air quotes now, that you always want to have uneven buttons, or any other details for as matters as well. Like you want to have 1, 3, 5, 7, like 4, 2, 6, like you want to avoid that. It's just more pleasing for the eyes to have an even amount of buttons, for example. But if you have like a shirt dress or a longer shirt, I mean, the eye, you can't calculate how many buttons there actually are. So if it's above, I would say 5 or 7 or something, you won't be able to calculate it quickly. So then this rule doesn't apply, I would say. but yeah, that's a quite typical rule which is just like a visual preferences, to be honest. So I mean, obviously you can do 4 as well if you prefer that, but this is something very common to have uneven numbers, just because it's more visually pleasing.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because I've seen this, for instance, because we talk about button spacing, and obviously if you have an oversized garment, say for a coat or a jacket, it's very common to see 3 buttons, and I guess that kind of makes sense then, because first of all you don't have to, and fourth, maybe throw something a little bit off, I guess, because when I go to think about it, a lot of the coats that I have that I bought in stores, they only have 3 buttons, never 4. And also I do have a duffel which have like toggles, so they are actually 4. But also, for instance, when you're adding buttons to a coat, I guess also you don't really have to do it that far down, right? It's most important to have it on the upper part of the body, because then you have the movement and everything. Because it's very rare to see a coat that is buttoned all the way down, for instance, if you compare to a shirt, right, Malena?
Yeah, I think it's functional a little bit as a slit in the front, that it's easier to walk in if you have a longer coat that is not actually buttoned to the actual bottom. But I think this is like a little bit of a matter of preferences and what you prefer. I actually have a few samples here with me. Yeah, I agree that usually you see it with 1 or 3 buttons, but I actually have a coat that is it has 2 buttons.
2 buttons, ooh!
Yeah, but this is actually something that I saw in when I lived in Shanghai. We went to the fabric market a lot and made, clothes for ourselves. So this is one of my Shanghai coats. So they maybe didn't really, stick to these kind of rules that we have. So they actually made 2 buttons only.
Yeah, and they also saved some money, right? Because every button counts. So maybe they were trying to to get a good margin on this. So less buttonholes and less buttons. So that makes sense. And also another thing that I think could be important to consider is also if you have the placket, of course, on your sewing pattern, and it has a specific extension from the edge to the mid front or the center front seam. But for instance, if you are using maybe oversized buttons, then you might need to extend the placket a little bit, because you don't want the end of the buttons to kind of cover the end of the placket, because that looks a little bit off. And I before we record this episode, I checked in a book that is called Reader's Digest: A Complete Guide to Sewing, which I highly recommend. You can usually get it secondhand, and they have a rule of thumb that says that the distance between the center front and the end of the placket should be 3/4 of the full diameter of the button. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to consider as well, because I definitely have made this mistake myself, that I kind of changed it, and it kind of looks a little bit odd. It's like you can't really, but it's just a little bit too much fabric, or a little bit too little fabric on the placket, and it kind of looks a little bit odd. So you do notice this stuff, and I would definitely now, moving forward, to be more mindful about that as well, to get that kind of proportion right, because if you are a little bit anal about the stuff, you will notice it.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's really both the placket width and even if it doesn't have an actual placket, but yeah, the distance between the edge and the button, like you want to have it a little bit of space there, and depending on the size of the button, like you want to adjust that. So if you choose some more oversized button or something, like you need to adjust that yourself then, because obviously the designer of the pattern have maybe used just a regular button size. So if you do any changes, like and this is again, it's not right or wrong, it's more visually appealing, like it looks nicer, it looks like they're more corresponding to each other. Otherwise it's going to be a little bit more like, you maybe not be able to pinpoint what's wrong, but like something is a little bit off there.
Yeah, and also I think there could be, if you go for a smaller button size than the original design had intended, you will end up with a lot of extra fabric, and that will kind of flip open and gape, and you don't want that distance to be too long between where the button hits, and because you want it to like keep the fabric in place, because there's a risk. I'm going to show you, if you watch the video version, that the edge of the placket might flip up because the distance is too far away between the closure and the edge of the fabric. So it can have a functional component to it as well. And this is kind of like things that you don't really think about when you start sewing, but it's you kind of notice it as you go. There are a few things that you could actually fix quite easily, but it's not easy to know what's wrong until you realize, yeah, right, of course, different button size, different size of the placket. Yeah, it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and something that is a little bit annoying, but here's something we did in school to avoid it. I mean, usually if you want to, when you have a big button, you really want to have oversized, it's a design feature, you wanted something to be really visible. The buttonhole is obviously then also has to be quite big. And then when you button it, and as we talked about earlier, the button is not going to be placed, if you have it, the buttonhole then horizontally, it's not going to be placed in the middle of the buttonhole, it's going to be placed to the side. So then you're going to have a very visible buttonhole zone, it's going to be so visible. So here we did it in school, actually, we had a project where we used really big buttons. We sewn first a smaller buttonhole, a fake one. We didn't open it up or anything, and then we actually sewn the button on top of that. So it wasn't functional at all, but it still had that a little bit of just a small buttonhole sticking out, so it visually looked like it was properly done.
Wow.
And the button sewn on top then, and then on the inside, so we actually could close it, we used press buttons. So then we faked it completely. So that was a really nice way to get that chunky button look, small buttonhole, so it looked real, but it was closed with actual press buttons.
Yeah, that's such a great idea. I never thought about that. Talking about going that extra mile, right, to make everything look top notch. And you actually just brought up a really good point, because we're going to talk about sewing buttonholes in just a bit, but if you have a lot of interpretation around that, you can actually just do that you can add a button on top, and then you just add snaps on the inside. So it's like a full buttoning, but it's a functional button because you close the garment with the snaps and the button. And it's not like it's not a cheat. It's actually, for instance, if for instance garments that are made, I've seen like from the 40s and 50s in very delicate fabrics, and they often have this particular. They maybe have fabric covered buttons, and then on the inside they are kept together with snaps, so there's no buttonholes. Also, if you're working with delicate fabric and you don't want to ruin that with trying to sew a buttonhole, the snaps are gonna be a big savior. And also, I'm wearing one of my versions now of the AV cardigan, which is one of my sewing patterns. And again, sometimes sewing buttonholes on knits is not the easiest thing. So an option that you can always use is to use snaps instead, either just doing these snaps that I have now, fabric covered, or you can add buttons on top. And that saves you a lot of anxiety. And you will see this in a lot of ready-to-wear coats and things like that as well, that they have this invisible closure with snaps rather than adding buttonholes. So
especially
really
when the fabric is really thick, it really helps a lot to have these snap buttons. And I also have a woven pattern that I made, the hummingbird tunic. It's actually a tunic for kids in kid sizes. So then I have a slit in the back, and I also have press buttons there. Just because it's easy to, when you have kids, they run around, and then it's easy when you dress them to just press it, and the kid can easily also pull it open themselves when they are undressing it, because they can't obviously unbutton so a button and buttonhole in the neck. So I really love this, especially for kids wear as well. And as you can see, it's really tiny. And this one you can also have, if you have a shirt, you can do it on the inside at the center front of like the highest bust point. If you want to add some extra security, just place them on the inside. It won't be visible from the outside or anything, but you will have just that extra button to prevent it from gaping. So these are my actual favorite buttons.
Yeah, they're so good. And I also, speaking of that, I speaking about sewing buttons, I did a cardigan once that I sewed actual working buttonholes, but the one that it was at the highest point, because it also had like a little bit of a neckline, so there were a lot of fabrics like intersecting. And so trying to sew a buttonholes where there are a lot of like seam allowance and fabric, lots of lace, it's going to be tricky to get that right. So what I did was that the final buttonhole, which was the neckline, I just did what you do there. I just put a metal snap instead, and of course I sew a button there on top. And I thought it was a nice design detail, and it saved me so much anxiety to have to try to be successful in sewing on that uneven layer. So metal snaps are your friends for sure. Yes. Don't feel bad if you use that instead. It actually can be a lifesaver in many ways, because it reduces a lot of stress. Because sewing the buttonhole, it can be really tricky, especially, as you said, there are so many layers, and not just the fabric, but you also need to have it reinforced so it doesn't like stretch out when you wear it. And there are seam allowances there, and especially for trousers, for example, that you have it in the waistband. Like, it's a lot of layers, so it can be really tricky to just sew it. But do you have I heard some people have like special machines that are just for it sews buttonholes so beautifully. Do you use your regular machine, or how do you do it? Yeah, I do that, and I'm actually grateful. I used to have an old Viking or Husqvarna that was from the 70s. I loved it, but I decided to upgrade for this particular purpose to get a Bernina instead, because Bernina has really great automatic buttonholes function. Because I was making a pair of pants, and I'm gonna post these. I still have them. I sewed them it's maybe 15 years ago, but we're gonna post it on our Instagram account, Stitch and Tales Pod. So it's a copy of ready-to-wear pants that I have fully functioned buttons all the way through the legs. So it's like 25, 26 buttons maybe, at least over 20 buttons. So I realized that if I if we're going to pull this project off, I need to get a better sewing machine, because what a nightmare to sew exact same size of over 20 buttonholes. So I ended up getting a nice second-hand Bernina that is computerized. It's from the late 80s, and I absolutely love it because that. Well, if you're not familiar with an automatic buttonhole, what it means is that you set it up and you do samples, and when you're happy with the proportion, the machine will memorize it. So we can just keep on sewing consistently the same size buttonholes over and over and over, as long as you don't turn off the sewing machine, which to me is a big bonus. And what's your setup, Malena? Do you have the same, or?
Yeah, I have the same. I have a Bernina as well, and yeah, it is just so convenient. I mean, because you don't have to stop or anything when it's gonna turn. It does that by itself. So all the buttonholes are gonna be exactly the same size. It had happened when for all of a sudden, like, yeah, you sewn it once, beautiful, and then you're gonna sew the other one, and for some reason the settings didn't stick. I don't know what happened, if I did something or if it was in the machine. So I'd always do 3 tests. Like, first make sure that, maybe even more tests until I get that first buttonhole to be perfect. Then I do the second one just to make sure that they are actually identical, and then the third one just to make sure that the second one wasn't a fluke. So yeah. Always do a test, and in the same amount of layers and everything that you are gonna use on your real garment.
Yeah, and also using reinforcements like fusible interfacing and things like that, so you get the exact same thing. And do you have a good rule of like starting point for how big the buttonhole should be in relation to the size of the button? Yeah,
the hole, not the seams like the stitchings, but the actual hole that is cut open. A good rule or general guideline is like the width of the button plus the height of the button, and maybe 1 extra millimeter or something, just so you can easily, again, when you do the test, cut it open as well and make sure that you are able to push through the buttons comfortably, so it's not too tight or too loose. So
and when you say the height, do you mean the height from the center point of the button out, or do you mean the entire height, or is it for the where you have the holes and that?
The button height.
Yeah, the button. Yeah, the height of the thickness of the button.
Yeah, thickness.
The thickness,
button,
right? Yeah. I was thinking, okay, yeah, it must, okay, the thickness of, exactly, because that's usually a few millimeters, right? So
yeah,
that's a good and a little bit of extra, but of course, you need to try this on fabric, as we say, as a proper sample, because it's really hard to gauge exactly, even though there's a formula there, the width of the button, the thickness of the button plus a millimeter or something like that. But definitely do samples. I very much agree with you with that.
And also just to learn yourself, like how to also open up the button in a nice way. I do the seam ripper. I know it's not recommended, but the way I do it is I do it from the like outer edge, and I do the seam ripper so it actually goes up like from the fabric before I start to cut it open, so it's like super controlled. It's not gonna like swoosh into the whole rest of the garment. I know exactly, and I do it in several takes, and always work from the outer to the middle of the hole. Yeah. Because is there anything worse than you cut, rip something open and it just you go into the garment? It's we feel for you. That's it has happened to everyone for sure, but I agree with you. I used to use the seam ripper as well. Another tip you can also use is to add pins at the ends, just to ensure that even if you're very careful, if the seam ripper is sharp, you might end up going a little bit too far. But otherwise, I do, as you say, work from the ends of the end towards the middle, and then you do it in the other direction, so that the seam ripper goes down both sides, and then you walk towards the center. And if you place pins at the end, you will also ensure that the opposite end, if you would slip and it would keep cutting through, there will be a stop at least where that ends. And you can also do what I've done And if it's thick layers, you can, do first the upper layer, then the bottom layer. Like, you don't need to do it in one take or anything. Like, you can do it little by little to make sure that it doesn't go too far.
Yeah, and there will obviously be a little bit of threads and fraying, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, you can cut loose those threads, and you have very secure stitching because the buttonholes has a very thick, dense stitching, and also you have interfacing and everything, so you don't have to worry if there's a couple of loose threads from the fabric after you're cutting. You just trim it away, and you won't have an issue. I actually, a while back now, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, I invested in what I'm holding up now is a buttonhole cutter. It comes in several different sizes. Mine is 12 millimeters and it's from Clover. And what I love about that is that I don't have the risk of slipping. So what I do is just that it has a sharp blade and I push it down. If the fabric is lots of layers, for instance denim, I use a hammer to just tug it through, and something to protect the surface underneath, of course. And you don't need to get too many different sizes, because even though mine is just 12 millimeters, which I think is reasonable width, you can just push it several times, if you have a larger up buttonhole. So I like this one, but if you have a sharp seam ripper, as Malena suggests, your method is definitely solid as well. But a buttonhole cut is so inexpensive, so I definitely think it could be a valuable addition, especially since seam strippers tend to get a little bit dull after a while, and they get less well suited for cutting through heavier layers of fabric.
And depending a little bit on the style, and if you have sewn it several times, or if you want to play around with the placement of the buttons, then it needs to be quite finished for you to be able to try it on. But you don't need to wait until the buttons and buttonholes don't have to be the last thing that you sew. As soon as the placket is done, you can actually add the button and buttonholes. Just if you don't want to save it until the last end, I usually want to do it a little bit as early as possibly, just to make sure that if something goes wrong, I haven't spent the whole making the sleeve, the cuffs and everything. You can do it earlier stage as well, depending a little bit, of course, on what style you have. I agree with you. Sometimes it's good to not postpone this kind of stuff, because it might end up in that to-do basket. And I heard, before this episode, I actually listened to Love to Sew podcast. They have also an episode about button and buttonholes. I think it is episode 119, if I remember correctly. And Helen said that she has a rule that no buttons or buttonholes are sewn after 10 o'clock. And I think that was a pretty good rule.
That's a solid rule, definitely. You need to be sharp, and you also should have good lights as well. I mean, try to ensure that you have a good setup, both mentally and physically, to be in that right headspace for sure. As for thread, if I'm sewing on a regular garment, I just use regular sewing thread in both the needle and the bobbin. If I'm sewing buttonholes on jeans, I definitely use top stitching thread in the needle and regular thread in the button. And also sometimes, even if you have, as we have, the automatic buttonholes function, sometimes you might need to manipulate the density of the stitch or the stitch length. Because, for instance, if like me, I'm using heavier thread sometimes, you might need to increase the distance a little bit, the stitch length a little bit, because otherwise the feeding will become an issue. And I should also say, on my Bernina, I'm not able to sew an automatic buttonholes with top stitching thread on denim, because it's just too heavy. So it doesn't read, it gets issue with feeding, and then you will not get that nice. So I actually do those buttonholes manually, actually, not with the automatic buttonholes function. So you have to see and what works for you as well. And also, if you're sewing buttonholes on knits, if the fabric is going to be really stretchy, you could actually use a thin elastic cord inside the buttonholes to add more durability and keep it in place, because there's always a risk that it might stretch out and not bounce back. You can also try to increase the stitch width a little bit again, just to get that nice feeding, because you don't have usually a problem with fraying on knits. And you would, for instance, like a blouse fabric or a rayon fabric or a silk fabric. So you can also try to experiment with the settings a little bit. You don't have to do the exact same setting as your machine tells you to do. Again, as we say, just do samples and see if you like the result and if the feeding is even, and then you're good to go.
I guess you can use, even if it's knitted fabric, you can use woven interfacing just for the buttonholes. I mean, it doesn't matter if the interfacing is just such a small patch that you use, then it doesn't matter if it's woven. It just gives that stabilizing effect when you sew it, so it doesn't get stretched out. And I also know someone uses, how do you say, the washable interfacing? Stabilizers, just to make sure that the buttonholes are not stretched out when you sew it, because as you said, the feeding dog, it might be a little bit tricky sometimes when you have a stretchy fabric, but this particular thing, you don't want it to be stretched out when you sew it.
Yeah, that's very, very true. And of course we talked a little bit about alternatives, and one alternative we already mentioned is using metal snaps either by themselves or adding a button on top, or going all the way as you did, adding also fake buttonholes. But we also have a few other options as well that I can recommend. We talked previously about bound buttonholes when we talked about sewing welt pockets. I have a tutorial on that on my blog that I'm going to link to. That's a really nice way of doing, where you have like strips of fabric instead, and it's actually not difficult. The only thing that is a little bit more time consuming with bound buttonholes is that you have to sew the buttonholes twice. So on the outside, you have the strips, the welts, and on the inside you usually finish it by folding. You cut open a hole and then you fold in the fabric and then you enclose it by hand. You can also add, I think, welts on the inside as well, but it's going to be quite bulky, especially if you're using like coat fabric. So that's one way of doing an option if you don't want to sew your own buttonholes. And also the thicker the fabric, as you said, Malena, the less it's going to be trickier to sew successful buttonholes. It just will work better on lighter weight material. So if you have like a thick coating, for instance, maybe a bound buttonhole is a better idea. Snaps is probably also a better idea. You can use like duffel toggles, and there are lots of different options like hooks, and you have so many different options. You don't have to sew buttonholes on everything. In fact, it's probably not advisable to do it on everything.
Yeah, no, there's a reason. I'm just picturing the like Chanel coats, those kind of types of design. You don't see buttonholes on them. It's more that welt buttonhole design. And it's there for a reason, because like boucle fabric is really thick, voluminous. So sewing a buttonhole there is just not gonna look so nice and polished. So definitely adapt the design according to your little garment design. And also, speaking of a little bit thicker buttonholes, on shirts or thin fabric, cotton fabric, you don't usually have a button shank on your buttons when you sew the buttons. I have a sample here. Like, there is basically no space in between the fabric and the button. But when you have if you have thicker fabric, it's more important than that you have actually a little bit of a distance between the button and the fabric. Because when you button it, I mean, obviously there are going to be a lot of fabrics in between here, so you want to have a little bit of space. Otherwise, it's not going to look nice. It's going to get stuck a little bit, and also it's going to be more friction on the fabrics and the threads and everything. So it's going to be more easier to tear. So don't don't forget to add a little bit of a button shank. Bigger buttons usually have a metal shank themselves, but if you don't, you can easily find nice tutorials on how to do it. I mean, for example, some are adding a toothpick or something a little bit...
Matchstick or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Matchstick is quite common. Just to have to get that distance between the button and the fabric when you sew it. And when you're done attaching the button, just explain
twist
what I'm
around.
doing. I'm losing my words.
You're twisting the thread around to form like a coil around that extra space. So and you will exactly. That's what we do, and you will see that when you check out ready to wear, especially if you say made with heavy fabric, you will see that kind of spiral around the loose thread or the extra shank, as you say.
It secures the threads as well. So don't forget to do that if you have a little bit of a thicker fabric.
And I also like to use, actually, especially if I'm working with like a garment made with heavy fabrics, and I also actually use thicker thread as well for the buttonholes, just for that extra security. It's just a nice feature to add a little bit, because it's so annoying. Because that's also one, I guess, again, where you skimp on things. I guess I've seen that quite common on ready-to-wear garments, that the buttons aren't properly secured, so you will end up losing buttons eventually. So that's one of the things you can actually fix when you're sewing yourself, to really secure the buttons properly and use good quality thread and everything like that, so you don't end up losing your precious buttons after wearing it for a while. And remember, it's a lot of stress on the fabric when you have button and buttonholes, especially when you attach the button. It's like such a small place where a lot of seams are sewn. So don't forget to add reinforcement maybe there as well, so the fabric won't stretch out when it's worn. And if it's really like, you can also sew, it's quite common to have an extra button on the inside for reinforcement, to really make sure that it doesn't get wet. So don't forget to reinforce on thicker fabric as well. And one thing that I also want to highlight, I've been working with kids wear for a couple of years, and especially with the kids below 3, they want to put everything in their mouth. So if you are using buttons on kids' garment, just make sure that it is properly secured, that it won't be able to be pulled away like with force, and the fabric won't break either, just because it's so easy for them to put things in their mouth. So that's something we really, when you work with kids wear, you have to think about these kind of things a lot and make sure to test them, and the buttons won't be able to break, and so really use durable stuff there. So just keep that in mind if you are using or making kids clothes. That's a very good suggestion. Because you don't really think about that, I guess, unless you're exposed to that kind of risk. So very, very good suggestion. And also another option that you can try if you don't have a sewing machine that makes good buttonholes is to try the dreaded hand sewn buttonholes.
I heard they exist. I never tried it myself, so I can't give any tips here. But there's a myth saying that they do exist.
Yeah, and you should probably try to avoid them unless you are very skilled. But just for fun, I'm holding up here a sample that I made for the AV cardigan, which I actually ended up, because of the fabric is so spongy, as you say, it's difficult to sew buttonholes on the sewing machine. I did try to sew. I mean, they are working, the buttonholes, but there were some issues. And I made 3, and you would think that they would get better, but they kind of got worse. But yeah, any older sewing book will show how to do that, but you have to be extremely focused and very precise. So every stitch has to be the same length, and you have to tie a knot just to secure. If you're good at it, it's a beautiful feature. If not, maybe not the first thing you should opt for as an alternative. I probably think a bound buttonholes is going to be easier to be successful with rather than hand sewing, especially if the fabric is not forgiving. it's gonna look kind of bad, to be honest. But yeah, you can try it. Of course, I did it a couple of years back when I did the AV cardigan launch, but I have not sewn one since then. I will be.
That was it.
Yeah, that was it. That was me. I do one every decade. That's my rule of thumb. No more. But yeah, we're gonna post. Definitely gonna post. Because not everything turns out great, so I'm going to be generous and show a close-up on this not quite successful hand sewing experience.
No, and button and buttonholes on knitted fabric, I mean, it's not really recommended on a loose, like your style. It's more of a cardigan, like it has obviously plus ease of movement, it's bigger compared to your body, then it's workable, and it's a more stable fabrics use as well. But I mean, on really thin jersey fabric, no. Then it's not recommended.
Yeah, definitely save it. But before we leave this episode, this is gonna go up on Tuesday, the 26th of November, I think. And both you and I, Malena, are also doing a Black Friday sale, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So we just want to pitch that, and you will of course be able to find that on our shops, and those shops are linked in the description section of this podcast episode, and of course also on our website, hazelhenpatterns.com. You can find Malena's and also on Etsy, because that's where you sell your stuff, and I have mine on shop.delaststitch.com, shop.delaststitch.
I'm curious, what are your sales?
Everything is off. That's what I'm going to say, and you can go over to that. And it's going to be not when this episode drops, it won't be live, but on Thursday, the 28th, I think I'm saying this right, then you will get 20% off all my sewing patterns, or almost all my sewing patterns, and of course all my sewing books, and also on my cover stitch course as well will have a nice reduction. And you can also get on my email list. I might do some flash sales or secret sales and stuff like that if you get on that list as well. And you, Malena, what are you doing for the Black Friday?
I'm actually trying a new thing now. I wanted to do buy 3, pay for 2, but I couldn't set up that on Etsy, unfortunately, for some reason. So I'm actually doing buy 2 and get 20% off, or buy 3 and get 30% off. So I'm trying that one this year. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, I will also have it from Thursday until Sunday. So it's a quite limited time offering.
Yeah, so you're going to grab a really good deal of our things, because we normally don't do sales as well. Neither of us do that. So this is definitely the time of the year that you will be able to get our stuff at a nice discount. Anyways, thank you so much for listening. And of course, also if you have more comments or for future Q&A episodes, definitely drop us a comment either on our YouTube channel, the Stitching Tales Pod, or on our Instagram account, Stitching Tales Pod. We're also going to, of course, post pictures from this episode. Speaking of buttonholes, we have a few things to share. Some nicer, some less nicer, including my hand-sewn buttonhole. Any final words from you, Malena, or something you want to plug?
No, just don't be scared of the button and buttonholes. You can do it.
Yeah, we can. Can we do it? You can do it as well. Anyways,
yes.
Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.